For years, Laura Wilson was the calm center of Laura Family Farms, a symbol of resilience, simplicity, and unwavering family devotion. Millions watched her build a life rooted in honest labor, faith, and rural tradition. Her world appeared unbreakable, shaped by discipline, routine, and love. But beneath that peaceful surface, a slow, invisible pressure was building. A series of deeply personal struggles, emotional strain, and unforeseen events would soon fracture that perfect image, exposing a fragile reality that few ever imagined. Laura Wilson's journey into public admiration unfolded quietly, shaped not by spectacle, but by discipline, patience, and unwavering consistency. Through Laura Family Farms, she constructed a world that appeared grounded, stable, and immune to chaos. Each morning began before sunrise. Each evening ended in physical exhaustion. And in between, a life of relentless labor, responsibility, and devotion took form. To millions, her story became a symbol of balance, proof that simplicity, faith, and work ethic could still carve meaning into a modern world. The farm itself stood as a living metaphor. Order replaced uncertainty. Routine subdued unpredictability. Hard work yielded tangible reward. Fields stretched toward the horizon. Barns stood weathered but proud, and family rituals anchored every passing day. Laura's presence infused this environment with emotional gravity. Her gentle demeanor, calm voice, and steady composure transformed daily tasks into moments of quiet reflection. Viewers did not merely watch farm life. They absorbed its rhythm, its peace, its promise of stability. Behind the camera, Laura embodied emotional endurance. She carried the dual weight of motherhood and public presence with remarkable restraint. While tending livestock, managing household responsibilities, and guiding her children, she also bore the expectations of an expanding audience. Millions looked to her not only for entertainment, but for reassurance, a model of perseverance in a world increasingly shaped by volatility. Her composure became her identity, her strength her signature. Yet, the foundation of that image demanded relentless sacrifice. As Laura Family Farms grew, the margin for imperfection vanished. Every action risked interpretation. Every decision invited judgment. The farm ceased to exist solely as a private sanctuary. It became a stage where authenticity and performance blurred into a fragile compromise. Laura remained acutely aware that vulnerability could fracture the image that sustained both her livelihood and her audience's trust. The reality, however, was far more complex. The discipline that once brought fulfillment slowly hardened into obligation. What had begun as purpose evolved into expectation. The rhythms that once grounded her now dictated her pace. Filming schedules layered atop farm responsibilities. Family life unfolded beneath public scrutiny. Moments meant for privacy became content. Silence became suspicious. Absence became speculation. Laura adapted with quiet determination. She refined her emotional control, compressing exhaustion beneath calm expression. Fatigue disguised itself as perseverance. Stress masqueraded as responsibility. Her resilience became not just admired, but required. And with that requirement came isolation, the kind that forms when vulnerability feels like failure. Still, the image held. To the outside world, Laura remained the embodiment of serenity. Her posture stayed steady. Her voice remained composed. Her presence radiated reassurance. Yet beneath those layers, the emotional cost accumulated silently. Each passing season deepened the strain. Each additional expectation narrowed her emotional breathing room. And each moment of restraint carved further into her internal reserves. What made Laura's story compelling was not merely her labor, but her restraint. She rarely revealed the toll, rarely disclosed the weight. The audience saw stability, but stability sustained too long without release becomes pressure. And pressure, when confined, begins to distort. Behind closed doors, emotional exhaustion settled into her routine like an unseen shadow. It did not announce itself. It did not disrupt outward function. It simply lingered, compounding, tightening, reshaping her internal world. Her days remained productive. Her presence remained composed. But the emotional margin that once protected her slowly eroded. The farm, once a refuge, became a responsibility without pause. The camera, once a tool of storytelling, became a constant witness. The balance she had perfected began demanding more than it gave. And still she endured, because Laura Wilson believed in commitment, in perseverance, in honoring the life she had built. Yet endurance has limits. Even the strongest systems fracture under sustained pressure. Even the most composed spirits carry thresholds. And while the fields remained calm, while the routines stayed intact, while the public image remained pristine, something beneath the surface had already begun to shift. But beneath the calm harvest fields, emotional cracks were forming, and soon, the hidden strain would begin to surface. Years later, the image of calm stability surrounding Laura Wilson remained intact, yet the emotional reality behind that image had begun to deteriorate. The farm still functioned with precision. The routines remained disciplined. The family structure appeared unshaken. But beneath that carefully maintained surface, Laura carried a growing psychological burden that no camera could capture. The pressure did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated slowly, quietly, relentlessly. Each day demanded emotional presence, physical endurance, and constant composure. Filming schedules layered themselves onto farm responsibilities. Family life unfolded under permanent observation. Even moments of exhaustion required restraint. Vulnerability had no safe place to exist. Emotional fatigue became a private companion, walking beside her through every task. Behind closed doors, the weight intensified. Laura found herself navigating a world where silence felt necessary and emotional honesty felt dangerous. The expectations attached to her image did not allow collapse. They did not allow doubt. They demanded strength, consistency, and gratitude without exception. Over time, this emotional discipline began reshaping her internal world. Stress was no longer an interruption. It became the baseline. The human mind was never designed to remain composed indefinitely. And yet, Laura forced herself into that mold. She learned to compress emotion, to regulate expression, to suppress exhaustion. Each small sacrifice seemed manageable, but together, they created a slow erosion of emotional resilience. The farm itself transformed in meaning. What once symbolized freedom and grounding began to resemble obligation. The peaceful rhythms she once cherished now dictated relentless pace. There was no true separation between work, family, and public presence. Every space carried responsibility. Every moment carried consequence. Psychologically, this constant state of vigilance produced isolation. Laura remained surrounded by family, yet emotionally alone. Surrounded by viewers, yet internally unseen. The paradox deepened, admired by millions, understood by few. Her emotional world narrowed as external expectations expanded. Gradually, subtle changes emerged. Fatigue lingered longer. Motivation required greater effort. Moments of joy shortened. The emotional reservoir she once relied upon began running thin. Yet outwardly, nothing changed. The smiles continued. The routines held. The content flowed. This emotional contradiction became the most exhausting burden of all. Laura's strength, once a source of empowerment, became an emotional prison. The inability to step back, to rest, to reveal vulnerability. These limitations intensified her psychological strain. Even moments of silence carried pressure, as absence sparked speculation. Public presence had become constant, and constancy left no room for recovery. Behind the scenes, Laura wrestled with conflicting needs. The desire to remain authentic clashed with the obligation to remain composed. The longing for privacy battled the responsibility of public transparency. Each internal conflict deepened emotional fragmentation. The human psyche responds to sustained pressure in predictable ways: emotional detachment, mental fatigue, diminished resilience. Laura experienced all three, not dramatically, not visibly, but gradually, quietly, persistently, and still she endured. Her devotion to family remained unwavering. Her commitment to the farm remained unbroken. Her loyalty to her audience remained sincere. But loyalty, when unbalanced, exacts a psychological toll. Each suppressed emotion accumulated. Each unspoken fear lingered. Each unresolved tension nested deeper. The reality, however, was far different from what viewers perceived. Laura's internal world had become a place of constant regulation. Every thought filtered, every emotion measured, every reaction restrained. The psychological effort required to maintain that control consumed energy she no longer had in abundance. Exhaustion ceased to feel temporary. It became structural, embedded. Emotional recovery grew elusive. Even rest failed to restore equilibrium. The weight followed her into sleep, into silence, into moments meant for peace. Yet no alarm sounded. No visible breakdown occurred. The strength she projected masked the fragility beneath. And the longer that mask remained, the heavier it became. Psychologically, this is the most dangerous phase, the moment when endurance disguises collapse and composure conceals emotional depletion. The absence of visible struggle becomes the very thing that allows internal strain to reach critical mass. Laura stood precisely at that threshold. Every system, no matter how disciplined, has limits. And when those limits are ignored, the consequences do not arrive gently. They arrive suddenly. They arrive decisively. They arrive when endurance can no longer compensate for emotional loss. Laura's emotional architecture, built on resilience and sacrifice, had begun to fracture under invisible weight. And although the world still saw calm harvest fields, steady routines, and a woman of unwavering strength, a silent reckoning was approaching, one shaped by grief, emotional overload, and irreversible change. Then, a deeply personal tragedy would shatter the emotional walls she had built, pushing her toward a breaking point. The moment did not arrive as a sudden explosion. It unfolded as a slow, devastating realization that endurance had reached its final limit. For years, Laura Wilson had carried emotional strain with discipline and restraint, compressing fatigue into composure, grief into silence, and fear into quiet resolve. But emotional suppression does not eliminate pain. It only delays its release. When the deeply personal tragedy struck, it did not merely disrupt her routine. It dismantled the fragile emotional architecture she had spent years constructing. The loss cut through every layer of strength she had built. It struck at the center of her identity, as a mother, as a caretaker, as the emotional anchor of her family. In that moment, discipline could no longer protect her. Routine could no longer stabilize her. The farm, once her refuge, became a landscape of reminders. Every familiar task now carried the weight of grief. Every corner held echoes of what had been lost. The emotional impact was immediate and profound. Grief did not arrive as tears alone. It arrived as silence, as numbness, as disorientation. Days blurred. Nights stretched endlessly. Sleep became fragmented. Appetite faded. Concentration fractured. The steady rhythm that once structured her world collapsed into emotional chaos. Yet, public presence did not pause. Behind the closed doors of her private suffering, expectation remained relentless. Viewers awaited content. The algorithm demanded consistency. Silence triggered speculation. Absence bred concern. And within that environment, Laura faced a devastating paradox. She needed space to grieve, yet her world demanded presence. Emotionally, this conflict deepened her isolation. The psychological weight of grief layered itself atop years of unresolved emotional fatigue. What had once been exhaustion now transformed into emotional paralysis. She found herself caught between memory and obligation, between heartbreak and responsibility, between survival and expectation. The farm no longer offered solace. Its routines, once grounding, now felt mechanical. The labor that once brought purpose became hollow. Even moments of family closeness were tinged with sorrow, shaped by what was missing rather than what remained. Grief altered perception. Time slowed. Sound dulled. Colors flattened. Emotion retreated inward. Laura moved through her days in a haze, functioning out of habit rather than intent. The emotional vitality that once defined her presence receded, replaced by a quiet detachment. And yet, she continued. She continued because stopping felt impossible. Because the identity she had built left no room for collapse. Because millions still watched. Because resilience had become expectation. Because grief in her world had no script. Psychologically, this stage is known as emotional disintegration, the moment when prolonged stress and acute trauma converge. The mind, overwhelmed, retreats into numbness. It becomes protective, detached, guarded. But detachment carries its own cost. It isolates. It distances. It fractures connection. Laura felt that fracture deeply. The emotional distance between who she was and who she appeared to be widened into a chasm. On-screen composure contrasted sharply with internal devastation. Each filmed moment required immense psychological effort. Each smile demanded emotional energy she no longer possessed in abundance. Public perception remained unchanged. The image of strength persisted. But inside, Laura struggled simply to breathe through the weight of loss. Her emotional reserves were depleted. Her psychological defenses exhausted. Her resilience, once unshakable, now fragile. The strain manifested physically. Fatigue lingered constantly. Simple tasks required disproportionate effort. Concentration wavered. Motivation faded. Even moments of rest offered little relief. Grief settled into her body, embedding itself into muscle, breath, and posture. And still she endured. But endurance without healing accelerates collapse. The emotional walls she had relied upon for years could no longer contain the weight. Cracks widened. Emotional suppression failed. Moments of vulnerability surfaced unexpectedly. Silence replaced dialogue. Withdrawal replaced engagement. Isolation deepened. Laura was no longer merely tired. She was emotionally depleted. The tragedy had stripped away the final layer of psychological protection. What remained was raw, unfiltered grief, colliding with accumulated exhaustion. The result was a profound internal rupture, a breaking point where strength could no longer compensate for loss. The world saw continuity. Laura experienced fracture. Her journey entered its darkest phase, a space where survival itself became the primary objective, where identity blurred, where purpose dimmed, where hope flickered uncertainly. Yet even within that darkness, something stirred. Not resilience, not clarity, but the faintest awareness that collapse, though devastating, also holds the possibility of transformation. Because when emotional systems fail completely, they leave behind open ground, fragile, painful, but capable of renewal. Laura stood at that edge, between devastation and survival, between loss and meaning, between collapse and the possibility of healing. And as the weight of grief pressed heavily upon her, the first quiet shifts toward recovery began to emerge, not as triumph but as necessity. Yet, within the darkness, the first faint signs of resilience began to emerge. Recovery did not arrive as revelation, came as necessity. After the emotional collapse, Laura Wilson entered a phase of profound reckoning, a period defined not by progress but by survival. The strength that once carried her through relentless demands had been stripped away, leaving behind emotional rawness and psychological vulnerability. In its place stood a quieter determination, to breathe, to function, to endure one moment at a time. The early days were marked by disorientation. Grief still lingered, heavy and unresolved. Exhaustion remained constant. The world felt unfamiliar, reshaped by loss and emotional depletion. Yet slowly, Laura began to reclaim fragments of control. Not through ambition, but through stillness. She stepped back. From the camera. From constant performance. From the pressure to embody resilience. This withdrawal was not retreat. It was recalibration. For the first time in years, Laura allowed herself to exist beyond public expectation. Silence replaced output. Reflection replaced obligation. In those quiet spaces, she confronted truths long deferred, that strength without boundaries becomes self-erasure, and that perfection, when sustained indefinitely, exacts a devastating psychological cost. The farm, once a symbol of relentless routine, gradually regained its grounding role. Daily tasks transformed from obligation into therapy. Feeding livestock, tending soil, walking through open fields. These moments restored rhythm to her internal world. Nature offered what the digital world never could: silence without judgment. Healing unfolded not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in incremental shifts. Breath slowed, sleep deepened, appetite returned. Emotional clarity, once clouded by exhaustion, began to resurface. Grief remained, but its sharp edges softened. Memory transformed from pain into presence. Laura's internal dialogue changed. Where once discipline dominated, compassion entered. Where endurance once silenced vulnerability, acceptance replaced resistance. She began to understand that collapse had not signaled failure, it had signaled human limitation. Psychologically, this stage marked reintegration, the process of reconnecting fragmented emotional systems. It demanded patience. It required confronting unresolved sorrow. And it required redefining identity beyond performance. For years, Laura's sense of self had been intertwined with productivity and composure. Now, she faced the challenge of discovering who she was without constant output. This identity reconstruction proved both liberating and unsettling. Silence, though healing, carried unfamiliar emptiness. Yet within that emptiness, possibility emerged. Gradually, she re-entered public life with measured restraint. Boundaries replaced constant availability. Authenticity replaced curated perfection. She allowed moments of vulnerability to surface, not for spectacle, but for truth. Her presence softened. Her tone deepened. Her perspective matured. The farm regained its original meaning, not as a stage but as sanctuary. Family bonds strengthened through shared healing. Grief became collective rather than isolated. And in those connections, emotional restoration accelerated. The most profound shift occurred internally. Laura no longer sought to embody strength. She allowed herself to experience it naturally. She learned to pause, to decline, to rest, to say no. These acts, once unthinkable, became essential components of recovery. And slowly, stability returned, not as perfection but as balance. Her story transformed. What once centered on relentless productivity now revolved around emotional awareness. What once celebrated endurance now honored restraint. Her life, reshaped by collapse, emerged more honest, more grounded, and more humane. This phase did not erase pain. It integrated it. The trauma remained part of her narrative, but no longer defined it. Instead, it deepened her empathy, expanded her emotional intelligence, strengthened her understanding of human fragility. Laura emerged not as a symbol of flawless resilience, but as a testament to emotional survival. A reminder that healing is not linear, not public, and not performative. And in that transformation, her influence quietly expanded. Because the greatest lessons are rarely taught through success. They are forged in recovery. But the legacy of her journey would soon reshape how millions understood strength itself. Laura Wilson's journey did not conclude with recovery. It evolved into something far more enduring, a legacy shaped not by perfection, but by truth. The years of silent endurance, emotional collapse, and gradual healing reshaped how her story was understood, both by those who followed her life and by those who recognized themselves within it. The public image of flawless resilience slowly gave way to a more complex narrative, one grounded in emotional realism. Laura no longer stood as a symbol of tireless productivity. She emerged as a quiet testament to the psychological cost of perfection and the profound courage required to acknowledge human limits. Her presence changed. Where once composure defined every moment, sincerity now guided her voice. Where routine once dictated identity, intention replaced obligation. She no longer performed stability. She lived authenticity. This shift resonated deeply. Viewers who had once admired her discipline now found solace in her vulnerability. Parents, caregivers, and individuals burdened by invisible pressure saw their own struggles reflected in her transformation. Laura's story dismantled the illusion that strength requires emotional silence. Instead, it revealed a more difficult truth, that true strength demands emotional honesty. The farm itself became symbolic of that transformation. It no longer represented perfection. It represented perseverance through imperfection. The weathered fences, uneven soil, and unpredictable rhythms mirrored the human experience itself. Flawed, fragile, yet enduring. In that environment, Laura rediscovered meaning not through control, but through acceptance. Her daily life slowed, not from exhaustion, but from intention. She chose presence over productivity, connection over constant output, depth over display. These choices, once unthinkable within the framework of public expectation, became the foundation of her renewed identity. Psychologically, this phase marked integration, the synthesis of past hardship and present understanding. Trauma no longer existed as an unresolved wound. It became a source of insight. Loss no longer dictated pain alone. Cultivated empathy. Emotional collapse no longer symbolized failure. It represented transformation. Laura's story began teaching lessons she never set out to share. That relentless strength can fracture the soul. That vulnerability is not weakness. That survival is often quieter than triumph. Her audience shifted alongside her. The metrics of admiration gave way to deeper emotional resonance. People did not simply watch. They reflected. They related. They felt understood. In this way, Laura's impact expanded beyond farming, beyond content creation, beyond public narrative. She became a mirror, reflecting the unspoken struggles of those navigating pressure, grief, and emotional fatigue in their own lives. Her legacy emerged not from what she built, but from what she endured. The collapse that once threatened to erase her identity ultimately reshaped it. The grief that once isolated her deepened her emotional reach. The exhaustion that once silenced her restored her voice, not louder, but truer. And through that truth, a new definition of strength took root. Strength was no longer relentless endurance. It became the courage to rest. Strength was no longer flawless performance. It became the willingness to be seen. Strength was no longer emotional suppression. It became emotional integration. Laura's journey revealed that healing is not dramatic. It is subtle, incremental, often invisible, and yet, it is the most transformative force a human being can experience. Her life, once framed by discipline and productivity, now reflected wisdom and restraint. Her days, once consumed by routine, now allowed space for stillness. Her story, once defined by stability, now embodied resilience of a deeper kind. Resilience born from fracture, humility, and renewal. In the end, Laura Wilson did not reclaim her former image. She transcended it. Her legacy did not rest in flawless harvests or curated moments. It lived in emotional truth, in human fragility, in quiet endurance. And through that legacy, millions came to understand a powerful realization, that the most meaningful stories are not those of uninterrupted success, but those forged through collapse and rebirth. Because some lives do not inspire admiration. They awaken understanding. Because some stories are not meant to inspire admiration, they exist to awaken understanding.